Hello listeners everywhere. Welcome to the Archive of Audio Antiquities, a voyage into the vaults of wonders on the wireless. In a moment, Simon Exton and Ken Moss will be here to speak to you.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Archive of Audio Antiquities. I'm Ken Moss.
I'm Simon Exton.
And this time we are listening to the Big Finish Doctor Who adventure, The Lovecraft Invasion. This was one of the Big Finish monthly Doctor Who range, written by Robert Valentine and starring Colin Baker as the Sixth Doctor, Lisa Greenwood as Flip Jackson, and Miranda Raison as Constance Clark. If you've not heard it, the story goes something like this.
Howard Phillips Lovecraft. He was a racist and an all-round xenophobe.
But the actual synopsis says, the Doctor, Constance and Flip joined forces with 51st century bounty hunter Calypso Jones to hunt down the Somnifax, a weaponized mind parasite capable of turning its host nightmares into physical reality. Chasing it through the time vortex to Providence, Rhode Island in 1937, they arrived too late to stop it from latching onto local author of weird fiction, Howard Phillips Lovecraft. With time running out before Lovecraft's monstrous pantheon breaks free and destroys the world, the Doctor must enter Lovecraft's mind to fight the psychic invader from within. Can he and Flip overcome the eldritch horrors of the Cthulhu mythos? And will Constance and Calypso survive babysitting the infamously xenophobic old gentleman of Providence himself? Well, let's find out.
Where are we again?
Rhode Island, 1937. More specifically, the city of Providence. How divine. Behind the car! Take cover!
What are they? They're bad news, whatever they are. Who is he?
Howard Phillips Lovecraft, an American author of weird fiction.
What kind of stuff did he write?
Precisely the stuff that the Somnifax needs, Calypso. Nightmare fuel.
Help! Flip! Flip, take my hand! Calypso, help! There are too many of them!
Mr. Lovecraft, please. We're trying to help you.
Help me? I'm not a complete bimbo, you know. You invade my home, you take me prisoner, and you expect me to believe a story so ridiculous it wouldn't make it past Farnsworth Wright on a slow day at Weird Tales.
What happens if it reaches civilization?
Like I said, it'll look for a host to manifest their darkest thoughts and feelings against the rest of the population.
Mrs. Clark, what on earth is going on?
Yes, I'll try to explain, but you may find it all rather hard to believe.
Try me.
Dr. Exton, it's
all
over
those
to you.
questions is, I don't care.
Oh, God.
This was... It's not the worst Big Finish I've heard, but it's not far off.
To put all of this in perspective, I know absolutely nothing about H.P. Lovecraft or his stories or anything about his background prior to this. Simon, you do know the stories quite well, don't you?
I do, yes, and I know the Call of Cthulhu game. I multitask my geekery. I do augmented reality games. I don't really do shoot-up computer games because I find them quite dull. But I love role-playing games. And one of the role-playing games I loved when I was first discovering it, actually the very first game I started playing, and the thing that got me interested in role-playing games was Call of Cthulhu. It's a really fun hobby. And I've done tabletop gaming, I've done live-action gaming, I've been to gaming conventions. I've actually been to more gaming conventions than I've been to Doctor Who conventions. Mainly because I find Doctor Who conventions horribly cliquey and gaming conventions really friendly and welcoming. Now, one thing that irritated me about this was the whole snigger behind the hand, my cousin was a gamer, but obviously I wasn't because I'm too cool for that sort of thing that the Flip character was doing. And yet she'd read the gaming books cover to cover and she knew exactly what all of the characters were. And she was upset about the fact that she'd been kicked out for cheating and reading the end of it. She was obviously into it, but oh no, we can't admit that sort of thing is worth doing because that's a different fandom. And we must defend our sticky little jizz hill or whatever. I found every time they mentioned the big cousin Darren really irritating and belittling, because if she just said, oh yeah, I used to love gaming and Call of Cthulhu was one of my favorites, or one that we used to play but I was never that wild into, would it make any difference to the story? No. Would it be belittling to another fandom? No. Whereas this was. That's the first of a number of negative comments I'm going to have about this. I'll just warn you for that now. I really didn't like this.
Coming to it from a position of complete ignorance about Lovecraft and the whole mythos, I actually found the imagery that it conjured up and the naming of the characters and the way they were described and realised in the sound design, it did draw me in. Now, whether what I had in my head, I know that the one that it is Cthulhu himself, the big octopus thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. But all the other creatures in there, and forgive me, I've forgotten all the names, but they were very vividly realised, both in terms of description and the monster effects that they were overlaid. I quite like that. And the problem well, I know, but you're coming at it from a different angle. You're coming at it from a position
somebody who knows the fiction.
Yeah.
So the description was pure Lovecraft. And they're things that were well described. The audio realization, I thought, was badly done. So the first things that we see, the Shoggoths, and it just sounds like somebody whispering in the background. And if this was an alien race, that would be quite creepy. But the Shoggoths, the noise they were supposed to make was supposed to be so disturbing it would drive men mad. So they really, really had their work cut out for them. It was a very ambitious thing for the sound designers to try and do. I suspect they weren't given an awful lot of choice about it. It's just we have chosen Lovecraft as the scapegoat for this particular politically correct hill that we want to climb, and we need to realize his works. But the Shoggoths didn't sound the way the Shoggoths are supposed to, because it's supposed to be really creepy and discordant, and it wasn't. The whole essence of Lovecraft's work, and actually ties in with his life a lot. It's about lack of control around your surroundings, but also about descent into madness. And both of his parents died in lunatic asylum. His father died when he was very young it was described as general paralysis. Actually, that's neurosyphilis. But he spent his entire life being terrified of mental illness, which is why loss of control and loss of sanity is such a huge part of the Cthulhu mythos. And other than him being bullied into going into an asylum later on in the story, that really doesn't come across. Whereas it's a huge part of the works of the Cthulhu mythos, and it's a massive, massive part of the game. One of the game's statistics in Cthulhu mythos is the investigator's sanity score, and seeing these creatures in game, you lose sanity points. The investigator's mental status is really key, and that didn't really come across. So I didn't think the sound design was well realized, mainly because they had been set an almost impossible task and were never going to be able to realize it well. But that's a problem with the people who made the decision about going into a Lovecraftian realm as a good thing to try and achieve on audio. And I think it was an almost impossible thing to achieve. But having read the stories and the novels, it's an integral part of the work that didn't work for me. Big Finish is usually extremely good on sound design. I think they fell over on this.
Again, with your description there, obviously from a fan point of view, you will have a very definite idea in your head of how these things should sound from the descriptions in the books. From somebody who's coming to it from a position of ignorance, I actually got a good idea of what these things should have been, or generally were. I mean, obviously they're going to be rough descriptions. Translating anything purely into either an audio or a visual medium from the written page is very unlikely to be spot on what it is on the written page.
Or even close. And that's the reason why there's been an awful lot of attempts over the years, and people who've talked about it, but there's been very, very little of Lovecraft's output that has been put across onto TV or film, because it's generally been regarded as pretty much impossible to do. Guillermo del Toro was talking about doing At the Mountains of Madness and gave it up as an unfilmable novel. And a chunk of that, I believe, was him saying that looking at it in detail, he felt that the Shoggoths could be realized visually, but they could never be realized effectively in an auditory medium.
Not having heard the preceding adventure in the series, have you?
What was it?
It was Scorched Earth.
No, I haven't.
Now, I can't work out whether this was a follow-on from that adventure where the Somnifax and Calypso Jones had sort of tagged along, or whether you were supposed to be thrown into an adventure that was...
partway through.
Yeah.
I hope it was a follow-on, because I hate that whole landing you in the middle of a story without setting it up beforehand. It was part of my problem with the Crimson Horror, although not my only problem with the Crimson Horror, particularly if Calypso Jones was just suddenly introduced as a new character.
Yeah, I got the feeling that Calypso
no
was a hangover from a previous adventure rather than just a new companion.
Oh, dear God, the TARDIS crew. Right, they had a bargain basement ace clone who was dreadful, but even worse than that, they got Miranda Raisin. Miranda Raisin, for God's sake. Oh, she is such a good actress. And they got her playing Paula Quatermass. She was nothing other than RP and ineptitude. Because the only time she's left alone with Lovecraft, she falls for I need to get something from the next room the moment the competent person is out the door. And it's, oh, yes, I'll just nip across and get it. You did say it was a green box, didn't you? Oh, where the fuck have you gone? Oh, she was dreadful. This whole, you could call me Mrs. Clark. Well, yes, lovely cut glass vowels, but would actually like a little bit of character. She was awful, and particularly because she was being played by such a wonderful actress. I mean, obviously she was in Spooks, but I'm watching Night Flyers at the moment, and she's just superb in that.
Having heard a few with Flip, Lisa Greenwood, that character does work. I know where you're coming from. If you just dive in, yes, a lot of these characters will sound like a cut price ace. The problem that they've got is that they are crowbarring in companions now. And there's only really, let's be honest, there's only really so many variations of companion that you can have. So the Eighth Doctor's got a few companions. There's Liv and Helen, but they're not really defined. Liv is more than Helen. With the Sixth Doctor, they've got Constance and Flip. Yes, they're all right. Either one at a time, perhaps. Constance is an attempt to do something different by having, a married woman and I've come aboard, but I'm going back to my husband, but they've already done it. The one thing I'll say about Miranda Raisin is it's not that, hello, terribly forced and what, oh, Doctor, where are we? It's not that horrible contrived RP. It sounds very natural. I don't know.
Oh, dear God, it didn't. No, I was expecting her to start answering telephones any moment. It was pure Paula.
She was more Miss Marple Radio 4 than hello, the modern RP. You'd have somebody rather than 1940s, 50s RP. It's somebody from the 21st century emulating that and going way over the top. And it's not. It was done in a very Radio 4 way that I got to give kudos to.
Well, she's an extremely good, competent actress. You give her a fucking awful character, she's going to play a fucking awful character. But if you're given a fuck awful script and terrible direction and a bloody awful character, it's not going to come out well. So no, she was Paula Quatermass in space. She lets Lovecraft fuck off at the first sniff of any kind of independence. Very often when you've got a new companion coming in, and whether she stays in the TARDIS or not, Calypso Jones was being written as a new companion coming in. And normally it's sort of the established companion becomes the de facto Doctor when they're on their own, and the new companion becomes their companion. It was the other way around. Calypso Jones was driving all the action, and Constance was running along in the background going, oh, Mr. Lovecraft, you really do need to be more brave.
Calypso Jones, I enjoyed as a character until she spaffs out a load of descriptions about herself. What do you call them? Labels, pronouns, whatever. And you think, what the fuck have you just done that for? Regardless of what you are, I don't need to know that. You're interesting just as you are. All of a sudden, you've pushed this, not agenda, it's unfair to say that, but you've pushed all these labels on us, and all of a sudden, that's all you are. And let the audience work it out through little snippets of dialogue sprinkled along the way, rather than a horrific info dump. We will come back to this, but that was the moment where my love for Calypso Jones was turned right off.
We're sort of dancing around the question of politics, and we're almost there, and we'll let you off the leash. But the other thing that I wanted to talk about was the plot itself, which was The Matrix or the holodeck, but not done as interestingly.
Sort of. I did quite like the whole idea that it was inside Lovecraft's mind, although there were horrific gaps in it. I mean, the main antagonist, whose name I cannot remember, it wasn't Armitage, was it? Played by David Menken and then Jonathan Andrew Hume. And basically, they were after the Necronomicon in Lovecraft's mind, but they could have got that in the real world. So that didn't make a lot of sense to me. They could have got that from anybody.
Yeah, so, you're talking about the Dreamweaver, was it?
The Dreamweaver, yes, but it took on a few different forms. But that didn't make a lot of sense. But the whole mind parasite going through Lovecraft's imagination at that particular period in history and experiencing all the things that were in his head, I quite liked that. There was a logic to the story. Unfortunately, the politics undermined the whole story, but I must admit, I did quite like the bare bones of the plot. I just think the way it was executed was absolutely dreadful.
I think Lovecraft's work was never going to work with this because it's so driven by mental illness and these things that will drive you mad and sounds that will drive you mad. They were never going to be effectively realized. And if you haven't read Lovecraft's work, then probably don't get that element of it. It's a bit like people who enjoy the natural history of fear without having watched Dark City. You watch Dark City and you realize just how massively derivative it is. Enjoy the Shoggoths in this until you read what they're actually supposed to be, and all of a sudden it becomes, this really doesn't work.
The final member of the guest cast really to comment on is Lovecraft himself, played by Alan Marriott. Again, this is more a story thing, although it will touch on what we're about to come on to. Although he's clearly a very damaged character and played in a style reminiscent to, what's the fella out of Day of the Moon, played by the guy of the Tomorrow People, Monsoon Man, Kerry Shale. It was that sort of character in my head. Quite mentally unsound and quite frail in many ways. But as a lot of writers have been, not entirely bolted on right. But the problem that I've got with Lovecraft himself is he was never actually a dick to anyone the whole way through the story. But the whole way through the story, everyone was a complete dick to him. Now, that immediately puts you on the back foot with the regular cast.
Constance kind of isn't, because she's so wet, she's not positive enough to do anything to anybody.
No, but hers is that underhand, early 20th century, yes, we know what you've been up to, but I'm going to be reasonably cold to you because I know what you're really like, and yes, Mr. Lovecraft, I'd really rather not be in the same room. Rather than directly addressing what she's been told about him, it's all danced around with Constance. Again, it fits in with the character, but the beef that I've got with this, and I'm ready to unleash the dam alongside yourself, of all the characters, the historical characters the Doctor's met, who've done some really quite shitty things, in comparison, Lovecraft is very low grade, and they were appalling to him in a way that the Sixth Doctor wasn't to people like Queen Mary I, Adolf Hitler, the First Doctor, all the historical figures that he met that were reasonably unpleasant, and he just let it slide. And you just think, of all the people to be an absolute arsehole to, you've picked on somebody that's a month away from death.
Yeah, I didn't like any of this. About the only positive thing I can say about it is that it cracks along at a fair pace and it doesn't ever slow down, which is great because I wouldn't have wanted to drag on any longer and I was waiting for it to stop. The final completely unnecessary thing where the Doctor goes back and just verbally eviscerates Lovecraft, who he knows from history, who he's talked to, he knows is a very fragile person who has opinions that were of his time. So it's not like Lovecraft was coming out with any opinions that many other people around him didn't. The thing about Lovecraft's racism, and there is no doubt Lovecraft was a racist. It isn't massively obvious in his fictional writing. There are reinterpretations, such as things like the deep ones were his fear and interpretation of people of colour and painting them as subhuman and subintellectual. But he doesn't actually come out and say that. Now, in his letters, he is very clear about his thoughts about the supremacy, actually not just of anybody who's not white, but anybody who's not English or English descent, because he spent a lot of time in England as a child, and he considered himself as a sort of English American.
Well, it is actually said within the story that his future is spoiled, or the future is spoiled, that one of his close friends publishes his letters, and he's absolutely horrified by it within the context of the story.
Yeah, August Derleth.
Yeah, that's the fella, yeah.
And whether you agree with his opinions or not, Lovecraft had the strength of his convictions to sacrifice his success, and he rarely got published in, I think it was Weird Tales, because he disagreed politically with the editor. And the other thing is, Lovecraft changed his political opinions, his viewpoints throughout his life, and particularly as a response to the Great Depression. His political viewpoint changed a lot.
Well, on the back of this, because I didn't know anything about Lovecraft, I have read up, primarily through Wikipedia, but also through other sources as well. I'm very glad I did, because the picture painted of H.P. Lovecraft here is one of an absolute arsehole with no redeeming features. He was just a hateful man that everybody should despise and burn all his books in a big fire. The actual story is a little bit more metered, and there's nuances, and you get a flavour of who this man was through the Wikipedia entry. I'm not excusing his views. I mean, obviously, but there's a well over 100 years have passed between him expressing his first opinions on the matter and the present day. Attitudes change. You can't historically revise things. Oh, Winston Churchill was a terrible racist. Yeah, Henry VIII probably was. Horatio Nelson probably was. He wants to blow big chunks out of the French. You cannot.
Are you going to have a go at Shakespeare for being sexist? Because he was.
How far back do you want to go? I mean, you can rip Shakespeare to pieces. Let's not undermine the contribution they've made to the shaping of our history.
And I was going to say, H.P. Lovecraft was quite supportive is probably the wrong word, but he was quite sympathetic to members of minority groups who adopted what he felt was the right culture. There's a lot of talk about how he supported Hitler, and he did it at a time, and that was sort of the early 1930s when there was a lot of support for Hitler. It was before the German expansion into other countries and the invasion of Poland and the starting of the Second World War. H.P. Lovecraft died in 1937. That was before all of that, and he'd already started tailing off his support for Hitler and his thoughts before his death. So Hitler, at the time that H.P. Lovecraft was talking about him, wasn't the psychopathic genocidal maniac that he later came on to.
Well, look at any figure in history that has gone on to be a dictator. At some point, they've been popular. They've not just strode into power, well, with the odd exception, but very, very few have strode into power based on being a cock. They've strode into power by putting a populist manifesto to the people and then turned out to be a bit of a knob.
And Lovecraft always disagreed with the Hitler idea of racial purity, and felt that those policies should be based around culture rather than descent. So if there was somebody who was of any racial group or culture who chose to embrace what Lovecraft felt was the appropriate apex culture, Now, that's not a good viewpoint, and people should be allowed to express and live in and be accepted for their own cultures, as long as it doesn't impact on other people. It doesn't actually make him an awful lot better than the things that Hitler was coming out with, but he did recognize the difference between culture and racial dissent.
People are allowed to change their minds.
Yeah, and he did. I mean, he changed his mind massively politically as a result of the Great Depression, and realised that the government that they had just wasn't working.
I mean, you and I have got very different viewpoints on certain things. It's never seriously come between us, and neither of us thinks each other is an arsehole, I hope, as a result of our feelings. But we wouldn't be mates if either of us thought the other was a complete dick for their views. Yep. It's just different
Absolutely.
opinions.
And we've spent hours and hours and hours discussing our different viewpoints in politics. And we can respect the fact that each other has different viewpoints. I should say, neither of us echo the viewpoints of H.P. Lovecraft, or even close when it comes to racial views. But we're talking about this 100 years later. His views at the time were socially congruent.
Yeah, this would have been nothing out of the ordinary. The problem that I've got with this historical revision we've got, and again, I must point out that this was released or delayed, and this I'll come on to now. This release was, I suspect, purely coincidentally around the time of the Black Lives Matter thing, the whole George Floyd murder over in America. Now, I have many opinions on that, which are not for this podcast. However, this is Doctor Who, and it's very clear that the release was delayed so they could pull it back into the studio and record additional lines to crowbar in and ram home, "We are against racism." It ruins the release because, as I've said so many times before, Doctor Who has been a very subtle, nuanced thing, particularly in the classic series, when it comes to getting political messages across. They've always been there in Doctor Who, always, always, always. But in the classic series in particular, there were an underlying subtext that was just racist, and then move on. And you got the message, the whole message was encapsulated in one line or one throwaway comment or one look. Hartnell can do this with a look. And move on and get on with the story. This is not. This is just ram, ram, ram. Lovecraft was a racist, you know. Have I told you, Constance, that Lovecraft was a racist? No, you haven't, Doctor. What was he? He was a racist, you know. Lovecraft, you're an absolute abhorrent racist, and I hate you, and I hope you die in 2 months' time. It's awful. It's fucking awful. It's the very worst excesses of virtue signalling. Everything I despise about storytelling. Because I'll maintain this. Underneath this, there is quite a good story for the casual listener. Evidently, as you've just demonstrated, for proper fans of Lovecraft, you're probably going to have holes to pick in it. But for the casual listener who doesn't really know anything about it, and that will be the majority, I suspect, there's a good story underneath. It was just fucking ruined by the virtue signalling.
I don't agree there was a good story underneath it. I think the whole idea of having a horror writer, a creature going into their mind and making the things that they write a reality that threatens the planet Earth, I think that's a brilliant idea. I think Lovecraft was about the worst one they could have chosen because of all the mental health problems and everything revolving around the descent into madness. And they were never going to be able to realise the audio on that. But, you know, if they'd gone for Edgar Allan Poe, that could have been absolutely astounding. And, you know, fuck it, it's Big Finish. They're bound to do about 8 sequels.
Yeah, you say that, though, but I don't know who Robin Valentine is, and I don't know what his background is, or whether he's a fan of Lovecraft, or they were just said, you know, let's write a story about Lovecraft because the mythos is quite interesting. But why would you write a story about somebody who's been that influential and basically just eviscerate them? Because if you're going to go down that route, basically every writer in history, you're going to pull them to fucking bits. And you're going to find, did you know that they had a mistress, you know? cheated on their wife. So he was a serial cheat. He cheated on his wife. He was awful. He was an adulterer, and that coloured his entire life. Many people have done that, but that's not the defining characteristic of any one person. If you're going to start picking apart somebody's, particularly in something like Doctor Who, if you're going to find somebody who is famous for, let's say, an engineer, but then the entire story is focused on what they did in their private life, what's the point of visiting that historical figure if you're going to ignore their work and focus on their personal life and not in a positive way?
Yeah, but I think the reason that this came about is that they're using Lovecraft as a scapegoat for what they actually want to write about, because this would have come out a little bit after the whole James Dreyfus anti-trans thing, and then him being not brought back as the Master, and Graham Linehan getting involved, and Big Finish releasing that big statement about how they are pro-minorities, which was fantastic and brilliant for them, and they didn't cave to pressure. But I think they wanted to write a story about a writer with problematic political views without being able to name either of the writers that they actually wanted to write about. I think that's where all of this came from.
But in what other scenario? I just have real problems with taking a historical figure who was arguably influential. I don't really
there's no
know.
argument. He was massively influential.
Yes,
but the point I'm making is I don't think that they wanted to do it with a historical figure. I think they had to do it with a historical figure because they would have been ripped to shreds had they done it with any of the currently influential figures. I mean, they couldn't have done it with anybody who was alive anyway, but it came across very much as, we want to make a point about this, and this is a convenient scapegoat for making that point. That was my takeaway from that.
It's not a bad appraisal, and looking at it through those eyes, yes, you're quite right. I just think that for all the fans of Lovecraft out there, what you've got here is a whole world, a whole imagination that's just been thrown under a bus to virtue signal a tawdry little point over and over and over. And what you've done is, well, for me, certainly, like I say, I don't know Lovecraft. I am not a fan, but I was turned against the approach here and ended up not really liking any of the main characters and feeling quite sympathetic towards H.P. Lovecraft. I suspect that was not the intention.
No, I don't imagine it was. And the thing that I really hated, I mean, there's none of it I've actually liked or enjoyed. The bit that I really hated was that final sequence where the Doctor is about to go to the TARDIS and comes back and just absolutely eviscerates him. And 2 minutes later in the TARDIS, the Doctor is clear that he knows that he's dying. Everything that he's going to do, anything that could change, is in the past. So all he's done is absolutely lambast somebody who is emotionally fragile, mentally ill, and dying of cancer, and will die within the next couple of months. Nothing that he says can actually make any difference to anything that Lovecraft achieves or any of his legacy. It is pure viciousness for viciousness' sake. It is the most vindictive thing I have ever seen or heard the Doctor do.
Completely
because
agreed.
There is no outcome to it other than ramming home your moral and intellectual superiority against somebody who cannot defend themselves. What happens if in 100 years' time we discover that pigs are intelligent and we can actually communicate with them, and anybody who eats bacon is a horrific monster? Does that mean that we're all horrific monsters?
I say this over and over, that for all this virtue signalling that's going on now and all these terms that are horrifically offensive that weren't 40 or 50 years ago, all these lovely woke terms that people are using now, just wait in another 30 years when they're considered offensive. And they will be, because that is how language evolves. Attitudes evolve. And nobody at the minute is using terms which are knowingly offensive. In 20 or 30 years, people might say, oh, we don't use those terms now. But that was a horrible, horrible... Particularly the Sixth Doctor. All right, he's a little bit bombastic, but he's not vindictive. And that was vindictive. And of all the historical figures that all the Doctors have met that they could have launched into just before slamming the TARDIS door shut, they pick on someone who's mentally frail, dying of cancer, and 2 months away from death fuck off. It's totally undermined everything that Doctor Who is, and certainly this horrible virtue signalling message. It's one of the things that I will openly slam Big Finish for, because I think that was a terrible misstep. And to go back into the studio and record extra lines to even further punch your point home and just turn this release into a moral preach, it's everything that I slammed Chibnall for. Big Finish, I'm going to give you the same slam. It's just not what we're buying these for.
I have to agree completely. And, I bought this one when I rarely buy Big Finish stuff because it's Lovecraft. And I thought they would probably do it pretty well. And we discussed it when I'd first got it. And your phrase was, it can't be that bad. And then you listen to it. It's fucking awful. I've written that a lot in my notes.
I mean, just as a final note, of the two of us, I am far more anti-woke than you are. But what was your take on the virtue signalling? Do you think that it was on point or a little bit over the top? Or cause
massively heavy-handed and childish.
That's all I need to hear. I mean, this is from someone who's far more...
sympathetic and humane?
I wouldn't quite go that far. But yes, you're more in tune with the current mood than I am. I think a lot of it is a little bit over the top, and cancel culture and this virtue signalling, in a lot of cases, goes way against the grain of what it's actually trying to achieve. But this, I am glad we're in tune, because I just think it was completely the wrong tone. On that note, it's time to rate this in earworms.
This is the song that never ends. Yes, it goes on and on, my friends.
You have had a lot to say on this. I think you feel even more strongly about this story than I do. I'm going to let you go first. Out of 10? 1 out of 10.
This was fucking awful. And the only reason it gets 1 point is that it's not slow and fucking awful.
Yeah, I'd like to know how the rest of fandom felt about this one. I've not really read about it, but I imagine this raised a few eyebrows on both sides of the fence.
I suspect it didn't. I suspect this was very much the wonderful people at Big Finish are calling out racism. Isn't it fantastic?
I was meaning more on the Lovecraft side of the fence, because surely the Lovecraft fans weren't overly happy at having one of their favourite authors shredded.
I mean, the thing is, there are a lot of Cthulhu Mythos fans now, and fans of people like Charles Stross. The Laundry series is unbelievably good, and a modern take on the Cthulhu Mythos. I haven't really seen any comment, and I don't follow message boards for pretty much any of the things that I'm interested in. So I don't know what the Doctor Who message board said about this. I don't know what the Cthulhu Mythos message board said about this. I suspect most Mythos fans didn't really take much notice of it. The ones that did are likely to hate it, I would have thought.
I would have thought so too.
But there is nothing to recommend this.
Oh, God, I'm really torn on this. Because I did like the underlying story, and I liked the characters and the monsters that were woven through this, but it was all totally ruined by the virtue signalling, and the tonal approach was completely wrong to a whole imaginary world that is clearly just absorbing.
Not particularly well realised. It is absorbing. It is absolutely absorbing. And over the years, more and more and more people have brought into it. So unlike things like Tolkien, where nobody has really expanded on his world or other single author stuff, H.P. Lovecraft spent his literary life engaging with communication with other authors, and the Cthulhu Mythos isn't just down to him. It's down to a lot of other writers, both at the time and since. I mean, in the 1980s, Brian Lumley was doing stuff like The Burrows Beneath. It's absolutely brilliant. Recently, you've got things like Lovecraft and Carter, which specifically points out Lovecraft's racism, and that his granddaughter, who's the Lovecraft in the Lovecraft and Carter universe, is a black woman. And she makes a point of saying HPL would have had a problem with this, but fuck him. Lovecraft County, which has been made as a TV series, has a very strong anti-racism plot. Meddling Kids. Meddling Kids is a wonderful book, and that combines the worlds of the Cthulhu mythos and Scooby-Doo. There is so much more to the Cthulhu mythos universe than Lovecraft's original stories. And this just comes across as rubbishing all of that, or, which is probably more likely, not being aware of all of that and not being aware of how the Cthulhu mythos universe has moved on beyond H.P. Lovecraft. It's a bit like, do you refuse to buy Hugo Boss's aftershave because the original Hugo Boss designed the uniforms for the SS? It's a completely different company. Nobody working with it is involved with that. And their aftershave is lovely. Are you still going to carry on harking back 70, 80 years when things have moved on?
Yes, and that's always been my point. You can't keep harking back to the past. This person, company, thing is associated with, etc., when times change. On the back of everything that has been said, and this is the second time that I've listened to this, I've got to say the second time around it was a far harder listen. I'm going to give it 2, but it has opened my mind to a series of adventures that I have never previously been aware of. I'm going to go and seek out Lovecraft and read it.
Read 2 things. The Call of Cthulhu
Mm-hmm.
and At the Mountains of Madness. And if you're engaged with the universe there, move on and read some of the non-Lovecraft stuff. So Burrowers Beneath, Lovecraft and Carter, Lovecraft County. Color Out of Space as well is really good.
It's something now that I do want to find out more about, and I suspect that that was not the intention of this play. It was to rubbish him and, bury his work as the rantings of a racist, and you just can't behave like that with historical figures, because if you scratch the surface, they probably all are on some level. It's, as far as I'm concerned, one of the worst things Big Finish has put out there.
And they'll continue singing it forever just because.
I mean, they have done worse. Doctor Who and the Pirates, I'm definitely looking at you on this one.
Peer Pressure, which was about 15 minutes of story, spanned out to 4 episodes. Even the author slammed his own work on that. That was really dull. And it had Roy Hood in it as Max Miller. That's how bad that was.
Fucking hell. Well, let's not do that, because for all we've just spent what feels like about 3 hours rubbishing Big Finish for doing this, and it's a lapse of judgment, and it's a terrible lapse of judgment, but actually they do some bloody good stuff. And what I would like to do next time, and I know we tend to alternate Doctor Who and non-Doctor Who, but I'd really like to do a Redress the Balance, really good Big Finish before we go back to non-Doctor Who. I don't want to leave it as a we hate Big Finish thing, because we don't.
Definitely not.
We just hate this particular Big Finish thing. So what do you fancy for next time?
Well, I think we should go for one of the all-time Big Finish greats. How do you feel about dust breeding?
Oh, fantastic.
Then we'll do that next time.
I love dust breeding. That was the first one they brought the master back for, wasn't it?
It was, and I'm ashamed to say I didn't see it coming, so the reveal was wonderful.
I'm delighted to say I didn't see it coming, because it was just, fucking aye. Fantastic choice.
I'm glad you think so, but it's one to look forward to. We will do that next month. As Simon's just said, neither of us really want to leave on such a down point with Big Finish. A lot of the stuff that we do across our podcasts involves Big Finish, and yes, they do put out some good stuff. This is just, this is not a high point. It's time for what we always refer to as Podcast of the Week. Really, it's Podcast of the Month. Simon, what have you got for us this time?
Absolutely nothing, because there is no podcast that I listen to that I want to be associated with this shite.
That's fair enough.
Podcast of the Week will come back next month, but there is nothing that I'm going to sully with this dross.
I will second that motion. Until next time, boys and girls.
Motion is a very good description of this.
Until next time, thank you for staying the course with us. We've gone on a little bit longer this time, but it's stirred up a little bit of feeling.
And if you do love the Lovecraft Invasion, please tell us why.
Until next time, everyone, thank you very much. See you soon.
Bye now.
The archive of audio antiquities featured Simon Exton and Ken Moss, and the announcer was Jenny at Blue Box 99. All featured soundtracks are the property of their respective producers, and no infringement of copyright is intended. Title music was by Edward White, and the programme was produced by Maverick Productions. For more information, please visit maverickproductionsuk.blogspot.com or find us on social media.